Welcome, my quiver of capitalists, the all-American American history teacher, the gold standard of economics, Professor G here, and today we are going to take a look at AP Economics, Unit 1, lesson number 4, the Production Possibilities Curve, the PPC. And before we start today's lesson, to introduce today's lesson, I want to tell you a story that was told to me in my master's program about 12 years ago from my professor. Told a great story, even though he was definitely an unabashed socialist, but really smart guy, told a really good story, and really intelligent. And I want to tell you this story to introduce today's lesson. My professor told me that when he was 8 years old, World War II had just ended, and his mother took him to Woolworths, which was the big department store at the time. And when they got to Woolworths, he said he remembered it to this day that there was just a line of women around the corner waiting to get into the store. And he asked the class, what were all of the women there to buy? And the answer was stockings. Because for the past 4 years, fighting World War II, America repositioned the nylon industry, instead of making stockings, into making parachutes. And for 4 years, women cannot buy a fresh set of stockings because all of that nylon was being requisitioned into the military industry to make parachutes to win the war. Now that the war was over, we had a less need for parachutes. The nylon could be redone to make stockings. So I used this story to introduce today's first concept, which is the production schedule. This is a more accurate and more realistic view of the previous lesson. In the previous lesson, we did nation A could do this, or nation A could do this. In reality, nations can do, with resources that are fully employed, nations can do a variety of different combinations of goods and services. So the production schedule illustrates the various combinations of goods produced at full employment of resources. And these are always output because they are dealing with the variable of production within a given time cycle. So let's just say, for numerical argument's sake, we have a combination of parachutes and stockings and different combinations of each. If we were to calculate the opportunity cost of parachutes or stockings, well, now we have all of these numbers. So the equation is a little more complex than it previously was. So instead of since this is an output question, instead of given up over chosen, we're going to have the change in given up over the change in chosen. You see change in y over change in x. So the opportunity cost, let's say, of one parachute, we are choosing parachutes to make parachutes, so we are first making 0 parachutes. Now we want to make 2 parachutes, so chosen would be 0 to 2. Stockings, as we go from 0 to 2 parachutes, because we can't produce all of everything due to scarcity, we have to now go from 200 stockings to now 160 stockings. So as we increase parachutes, we have to decrease stockings. This is really our first question, our first fundamental economic question: what to produce. We cannot produce everything of each, therefore we have to make a certain combination. We have to make choices due to that scarcity. So this is also very important to add absolute value. There are no negatives in your calculations. So we would have 200 minus 160, 0 to 2, and we would have 40 over 2. So we would say the opportunity cost of one parachute would be 20 stockings. And we can do it in reverse. Always start at 0 unless the test tells you to start at a different location. Same thing if they ask you to compare two nations. If you're comparing absolute value, always start at when they're just producing one product. So if they're comparing two nations, let's say America and Canada, and they say who has the absolute advantage of parachutes versus who has the absolute advantage of parachutes, you would start where they're only producing parachutes. Compare that number for if they ask you to compare two different nations. Let's go to the opportunity cost of one stocking. We have the change in given up over the change in chosen. In this case, we are choosing stockings, so that is our x. It goes on the bottom, on the denominator. So as we go from 0 to 40, as we choose to produce stockings versus parachutes, we now go from 10 to 8 in parachutes. So we have 10 minus 8 over 0 minus 40, or 0 to 40 rather, the difference between them, and 2 over 40. So we would say that the opportunity cost of one stocking is 1/20th of a parachute. In reality, probably more than that. And this is a constant opportunity cost. If you would keep going from A to B, from B to C, C to D, D to E, and E to F, you would see it would always be 20 stockings or 1/20th of a parachute. And so there would be a constant opportunity cost, and in this case it is constant because the industries are related to each other. It would take similar labor skills, it would take similar machines to switch between producing those goods. In this case, the material of nylon, the sewing machines, people who know how to deal with the material would be similar. So it would be a constant opportunity cost. Whereas, like blue jeans and fire engines, that would be an increasing opportunity cost. The two are not related to each other, so as you trade off, the opportunity cost would increase. Now what we're going to do with this chart is we're going to take a look at our production possibilities curve, which is our graph that visualizes this concept. So here we have our visualization of the nation's production schedule. The one we just did with the parachutes and the stockings would be the constant slope. The slope is the opportunity cost. So if we were to have graph paper and we were to assign numbers and we would do rise over run and draw the slope would be the opportunity cost of the rise over run would be the opportunity cost. But the test is really never going to ask you to do that. Graphs serve as a visualization of the economy and economic concepts, and in this case the production possibilities curve serves as a visualization of a nation's production potential. And here we have all of the purple dots. Well, actually, before we go to that, let's take a look at this other PPC. Same thing, since the slope equals the opportunity cost, this is called a concave PPC. And this PPC represents the law of increasing costs. It is shaped differently because it illustrates that good A and good B are unrelated industries. And in the Barron's Review book, the example they use are the production of guns and butter, that the two are very unrelated industries. The factories would be different, the labor skills would be different, the machinery would be different, and as you trade off from one, you actually sacrifice more of the other. And if you were to plot it out, you would get this concave graph. So just immediately from the graphs visualize the relationship between the two industries. You automatically know that these two industries are related because of the constant slope. And on this graph, you automatically know that good A and good B are unrelated because of the concave slope. Now let's take a look at all of these points, what all of these points mean. When you draw it, you don't draw all of these points. You just draw your two axes, and you either draw if they're constant, and the question will tell you if it's constant, you draw the slope going like that, or if they're unrelated, you draw the concave slope. No dots until the test tells you to put dots. But let's go through what all of these dots mean. All of the purple dots on each graph, all of the purple dots represent, because they are on the PPC themselves, they represent full employment of resources. And if the dot is on the extreme, it shows that this dot has 100% production of good A and 0% production of good B. So any dot along, if it's 100% and 0, if it's in the middle, any dot along the PPC represents that resources are fully employed, that the nation is maximizing its use of resources. When we get to unemployment, we're going to see that full employment does not necessarily mean 0% unemployment. There is a natural 4% rate. So full employment of resources means it still includes 4% unemployment, but we could assume that resources and technology are being fully, to the fullest extent and to the most efficient extent, utilized. The orange dot, well, if the purple dots on the PPC represent full use of resources, the orange dot represents an underutilization of those resources. So that means we have the resources, but we're not using them. Why would we not be using them? Well, that probably means that something's wrong within the nation. So this is probably a recession, and the purple dot probably shows us that we could assume, the orange dot, we could assume if the nation's operating here, the nation is suffering from unemployment. Here you would have a high unemployment, like 6-7%. We have the resources, but we're not using them. And who's being affected by that? The labor force. So as those factories are not being used, that's people not being used. So we can assume purple dots on the PPC, full employment of resources. The orange dot inside the PPC is underutilization of resources. It is a recession, the nation is suffering from unemployment. We have the resources, but we're not using them. The green dots, if the PPC represents full employment of resources, well, the green dots are unobtainable with the current resources. So this represents the maximum production potential. The line itself represents the maximum production potential. Therefore, the green dot is unachievable right now with the current resources. What we're going to take a look at next is how do nations extend the PPC, and how do they try to, in the long term, and how could they get to this dot in the short term. Now, what all nations desire is to continually to increase their production capacity, their production potential. So, a long-term permanent change to the quality or quantity, two Q's, quality or quantity of resources and technology will shift the PPC. So here we have a positive increase in either quality or quantity of resources or technology. Major innovations from personal computer to the internet, even to fracking and offshore drilling and building new pipelines. This is an increase or discovery of new oil. This would be a major increase to the production potential of a country. And we would see in either consumer goods and capital goods a shift to the right. That means before this innovation, nations could only, this was the maximum nations could produce. Now, after this increase to either the quality, the long-term quality or quantity of resources or technology, the nation now has a greater production potential. which means it now has a greater ability to produce and can create a greater combination of consumer and capital goods and services, versus a long-term decrease to the quality or quantity of resources or technology. Losing minerals, losing resources, shutting down oil and oil exploration. These kinds of things push a nation backwards. And so any type of long-term quality or long-term decrease or permanent decrease to the quality or quantity of resources or technology will decrease our max production potential. So whereas we used to be able to produce over here, that this was our greatest combination of goods and services, something negative happened, and there is now a shift of the curve to the left. So a rightward shift of the curve shows, and you always have to, very importantly, you must always draw the arrow. The arrow indicates that an economic change is occurring. When you graph it out, you must draw the arrow. So a rightward shift indicates that this is an increase in the nation's production potential. A leftward shift, again, draw that arrow. You will lose points if you do not draw the arrow. The arrow is visualizing that an economic change happened, and the arrow is also visualizing, here is the previous, here is the new PPC. So on the left always equals a decrease. And generally in our graphs, throughout all of our graphs, right is increase, left is decrease. Now, versus some of the previous concepts from the previous slide, that here, a point outside could be achieved with trade. The nations create terms of trade based on their opportunity cost, and in the short term, they are able to achieve a point outside their PPC. So this would be possible with mutually advantageous trade. Trade would not be a shift of the PPC because there is no change, long-term or permanent change to the quality or quantity of resources or technology. Now, a leftward shift versus a point inside the curve. The leftward shift shows that the resources are decreasing. Something about the resources, either their long-term quality or quantity, are decreasing. However, a point inside the curve shows that we have the resources, but we are not using them. So be careful. This is unemployment. This is something of a long-term quality or quantity shift to the left. So how can nations achieve this? I mean, sometimes it's just innovation happens, electricity, gasoline, the airplane, the internet, 5G revolution. Some of these things naturally happen, and we see them naturally happen in capitalist societies most often, as capitalism is the driver of innovation. But government can put money towards research and development. We saw that when President Obama, during the stimulus plan, had a massive push towards green energy. Didn't work out with the Cylindro company, but it was the right idea. Let's try to invest in a new type of energy to try to potentially move the PPC forward. So government can do that. We're going to talk when we get to the banking system. We will see that low interest rates over the course of a long period of time stimulates investment spending. That means businesses spending on capital, which is resources, which is technology and equipment, and also a general focus over the long term on capital, goods, and services. We actually got to see this with Stalin's 5-year plan. Where Stalin literally changes his combination of almost no consumer goods and services to only capital goods in an effort to, over the course of 5 years, literally shift the nation's PPC rightward and now have a greater production of goods and services, but just in the capital sector. So over a long period of time, if there is a general focus on capital goods, because capital goods tend to transcend society, like the internet was originally a military invention, and then it becomes a consumer good. So over the long term, if a nation focuses on capital goods, that can shift the entire PPC. Another question to be aware of is if the question just specifically says the change to the quality or quantity of goods and services occurs only in a specific area. So let's say it is a change only to, let's say the question is, and sometimes the AP test does that, let's say we have a PPC and there's a change only, a long-term change, only in the quality of consumer industry. In that case, you would have the PPC shift rightward, but only in the consumer goods segment. Notice how the capital goods remain the same and the consumer goods increase. So just be careful on the AP test if the question is saying that it is one of several different things. Is it a shift of the entire PPC? Is it an increase in quality or quantity? Is it a decrease in quality or quantity? Or is it short term? Is it trade or unemployment? It's simple, but there's a lot of ways in which they try to trick you. So be careful of those key words in the question. It's really only a few rules, but just be very careful when you're answering the question. If what are the keys? What are the key words that are saying what happens to the PPC? Other than that, the production possibilities curve, as we just showed, is a visualization of the economy, where we are, where we want to be, and what we can do, or what happens to the economy when certain outside events happen, and how that changes our economy. This is Unit 1. Thank you for watching. Remember, money never sleeps.